There is value in your voice, especially when it comes to mental health. Hi, I'm Stephen G. Winmall. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm your host for the Avidum podcast. Avidum is a nonprofit that empowers students to shatter the silence around mental health and suicide. In this episode, we'll hear from students who went to an Avidum conference in Pennsylvania's Lehigh Valley. And these students talk about an issue you don't hear a lot about in public: self-harm. We want to offer a warning for our listeners, as this episode contains references to self-harm. Please take care of yourself if this topic may be triggering.
We're going to say Avidum, I've got your back. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Avidum, I've got your back.
Before we hear from the students, I think it's helpful to set the scene. Hundreds of students from across Pennsylvania connected with each other at the Amplify Avidum conference. There was one in Lancaster, and another one was in Bethlehem. I was fortunate enough to lead a session at the Bethlehem conference where I talked about the power of speaking up. I shared some moments from this podcast, and after the session, several students came up to me and told me they wanted to be a part of this podcast too. So here it is. We're only using their first names to identify them. First up, Kyla and Steven, two high school friends who discovered they were both practicing self-harm. Here's their story. How did you get to the point where you felt that self-harm was a way to address your mental health? And Kyla, we can start with you.
Right. So I think over time, I kind of kept pushing down my emotions and saying that they weren't real or that they didn't exist. And then it got to the point where I would tell my parents, and they didn't really seem to be too reciprocative of whatever was happening. So I felt that was a way for me to take control and finally have the control of a situation in my life.
Taking control, does that sound similar to you, Steven?
I'd say that my experience with this is that self-harm is an accumulation of everything happening in your life, and that when you have certain experiences, you try to tell yourself that you don't believe that is a significant issue. You will have certain emotions or feelings that you will try to normalize with yourself and think that this is okay, I can live like this, and you don't seek help otherwise. And when it gets to that point, you eventually break down and you feel that there's no other option but to hurt yourself. And the way that many people see self-harm, and many of the people I've discussed with see self-harm, is it is a way of realizing your problems as a physical thing, because all of these problems are within your head, and you gain proof by seeing it on your skin and saying, this is what I've been through. And it's a way to show yourself that, you've dealt with these issues.
That's really powerful. So in some ways, self-harm is the embodiment of the things that are going on in your brain just happening in real life. I want to ask both of you this, and just a warning for our listeners. We're not going to explain how self-harm happened in these cases. But my question to you is this: how did self-harm make you feel? And Kyla, we'll start with you.
So I never really thought it was an issue. I more of just took it as what it was, and I never really addressed the fact that it was actually harming me. But in the moment, it made me feel better. And I think that's why I invalidated what it actually is and how dangerous it can be. So definitely in the moment, it makes me feel better, but there are so many other ways that you can do that. So resorting to self-harm, honestly, it's not necessary.
And that's a revelation that takes time, right? So Steven, how did self-harm make you feel?
Originally, when I started having mental health struggles, I vowed to myself that I would never do something so extreme. I would never attempt to take my own life or self-harm. And eventually it got to a point where, it built up and that happened. But as for how it made me feel, I would say that it was almost a relief in a way. And I had proof of what I was going through now, but in the exact moment, it really felt like I could breathe again for some reason. I never really understood why it was that way, but when I had gone through it, immediately afterwards, I felt a significant amount of relief and almost brief euphoria in some ways. It was just a surreal experience, and not certainly one that anyone should have to go through or want to go through, but it was something that was relieving in the moment.
And so we have different perspectives here about how self-harm makes people feel. But, the good news in all this is that there's a way out. So what did you do to find a way out of self-harm? How did you make that happen? Kyla?
It's a long process to get there. I had to be hospitalized to realize, to get away from that, environment where I felt it was necessary. So I was gone for a couple of weeks, and I realized, hey, I can live without this. There are other ways to make myself happy, to get rid of stress that don't involve hurting myself or other people around me, right? So it was a lot of that. And obviously at times I still do feel urges and stuff like that to do that, but I know that now I have other things like playing guitar or writing or anything like that can just help me in that moment.
And Stephen?
In my hospitalization process, the most important thing I realize is that I have every tool I need to succeed, and that everything is here for me, that I have, everything is around me, that I can be better than what I have previously done. And so in realizing that, when I was in the hospital, I took every tool that I learned about and that I realized, hey, I already know how to do this stuff. I need to start implementing it, and I need to start recognizing, hey, I need to tell myself that we can do this, we got this. And I think that once I understood that, things became a lot easier. And there's no clear road to recovery from these types of things. It's always a long journey. It's always going to be ups and downs, and you might have times where you go back to that same spot. But the big point is you have to be self-aware, you have to rely on people, and you have to pick yourself up even when you get pushed down.
Now you'll hear from Alexia. She was diagnosed with depression and anxiety at an early age, and she too has dealt with self-harm. Here's our conversation.
I would shut people out of my life, not talk to them. I would stay in my room where it's dark, no phones, no TV, just start crying out of nowhere. I didn't want to be there at that time. It was, and I also used to fidget, and I still fidget because my anxiety. But it was a hard time where it eventually grew worse than we thought it would, with some of the events has happened in my life.
Can you describe for us what led to your self-harm? And I know that we had a conversation before, and you mentioned that you've stopped that, which I know is a healthy choice. But if you can take us back to what kind of led you to start self-harming, and then if you could talk about how you found the courage to stop.
What led to it was a lot of people bullying me, especially when I grew older and I came into a different state and new school, new environment, and people didn't think as me as someone who can fit in. So, of course, with my anxiety, I did some things that I'm not proud of, and I hope that you can realize, but the bullying is most of the part where I was self-harming myself, trying to kill myself. It was pretty bad back then, but I'm getting help now. I'm on medications that are helping me right now, and that's a good thing, because I don't want to be back in that hole where I can't get help.
What was the turning point for you? Obviously, when you're going through something like this, it's kind of hard to see clearly. And I know that you mentioned, thankfully, you're coming up with some solutions, including medication, to help you stop. But how did you make that decision? When was enough for you?
I saw after a couple times I was in the hospital, I saw how badly it hurt my family. I wanted to get help. I didn't want to be in that situation. I wanted to be a better person for myself and for my family. So we immediately were looking for therapists, psychiatrists to help me, not exactly get rid of it, but to help me understand why I have it and how I can prevent it from happening.
And I think, I can clearly say that I'm very grateful that you're still here. And I'm grateful that, you found a wake-up call as an opportunity to do something different. And so I guess my final question to you is, how do you manage your mental health now? You mentioned medication, but what are some other things that you've been doing to kind of help you keep your mental health strong?
I have my therapy appointments every 2 weeks. I have my psychiatrist appointment to help me manage my medications. I listen to music when I'm feeling down, upset, or just about done with life. I also talk to my parents sometimes, which they definitely help a lot. They help me understand that they're here for me and that I'm not alone in this fight. And Avidum has also helped me with that.
That's so wonderful to hear. Um, did you feel like you couldn't talk to anyone when you were going through that rough patch in your life?
I did feel like I had someone to talk to, but I felt like couldn't understand what was happening because most of my depression comes with my family. It's been passed down through generations, but my grandmother is one of those depression items that come into the bundle. Um, I sometimes I still feel that I can't get help or I'm worthless, but I'm trying to have help where I can understand those things a little bit better and be able to recognize when I'm down and how to get out of that mood.
And Alexia, I know that takes a lot of self-work. And as someone who is going through therapy as well, it's just this process that we have to go through. But I want to applaud you and I want to thank you for sharing your story with all of us at Avita.
Of course.
Speaking up can be scary, especially about something like self-harm. So we wanted to learn more about it through a professional expert. Kay Bella is a licensed professional counselor and a holistic wellness coach. Here's how she sheds light on self-harm. So, Kay, thank you so much for being here on this podcast. One of the topics that kind of surprised me as something that a lot of our students are dealing with is self-harm. So why don't we start there? Can you describe for us what self-harm is?
So self-harm, put simply, is just somebody who is deliberately injuring themselves. So deliberately self-injuring.
And I know that, this can happen in many different forms, and we want to be careful not to provide information that might encourage someone to pursue self-harm. But what are some of the motivating factors? What might compel someone to self-harm?
It often comes up as an outlet for emotional pain and trying to turn that emotional pain into something physical. And then it can also be a form of self-punishment if there's low self-worth, depression, anxiety, a lot of stressors. They're just taking that on themselves, and so they feel they've done something wrong, and so it's a form of self-punishment. Maybe it's even been done to them through abuse. And also, it can be a way that people try to seek somebody who cares and let people know what's going on when they maybe don't have the language around emotional vulnerability and communicating their feelings. So seeking someone who cares, and then also sometimes it's a cry for help where maybe they have been telling people for a while and they don't feel that they're being heard or at least understood, and they're not getting the care and support that they need. So self-harm can be a physical manifestation of, hey, this is really, really painful and I don't know what else to do aside from this.
I never really thought about self-harm being a cry for help because I think a lot of times it's kind of unseen. Maybe perhaps people who are self-harming want to hide those parts of themselves publicly. So it's really interesting to hear that this could actually be meant as a message for other people. So I wanted to get your take. Let's say that someone listening is in the practice of self-harm. What advice or insight do you have on that?
I always, as a therapist, I talk to the person about why they're self-harming before I try to offer any support or guidance, because the support that we offer and what we're going to work through is going to be different based on why they're doing it. So if, for instance, it's an outlet for emotional pain and they're trying to turn it into something physical, then we're going to try to come up with healthier outlets for those emotions. So sometimes it may look like athletics, kicking or throwing a ball or something. Being part of running, it brings in a natural element of that fight or flight motion, that's really part of what's being activated in the brain. Journaling, that's a physical manifestation. You can see it on paper versus keeping it inside. Talking to somebody who's been in a similar place, sometimes even ripping up a piece of paper, doing art, turning it into music, whether that's an instrument or lyrics or spoken word, and even just listening to music. I like to turn it up real loud and sing in my car, and if nobody's around, that kind of thing. It's that music that just speaks to your soul on a deeper level. And some turn it into dance. But basically what we do is it's all about asking the question. So, okay, why are you self-harming? And, what can we do to help you to find a healthier outlet for that emotion?
I love that there are so many different ways to counteract this. And I think that's helpful information for our listeners. But let's say that someone is listening on to this podcast and they may know someone who's self-harming, or they're trying to identify the signs. You mentioned that, sometimes self-harm can be a cry for help. So how can people recognize that cry?
I would say, I think sometimes we may notice some signs and we may say like, oh, that person, maybe they're just off for today. But sometimes that off for today becomes off for a week and then off for a little bit longer. And so sometimes it's a duration thing where the signs and symptoms just really don't seem to be going away. You give lots of advice and you try to tell them how to work through it and stuff, and it's just not. They keep saying it's not working, it's not working, it's not working. Sometimes it's the severity of it too. So there's duration, there's severity. So, maybe they're saying things like, I don't want to be here anymore, or I just don't feel like I just feel stuck. I don't know what to do with all of this emotion. So paying attention to those kind of things, if the person is doing it in a way that is like trying to hide certain parts of their body. So if they self-harm on their arms or, their legs or something like that, they may try to cover up that part of their body. If it's something that is maybe like an eating disorder kind of thing, you may start to notice a fluctuation in weight or body image, those kind of things. And so just noticing, being attentive to those kind of things. No, a lot of times it's just knowing your friend. You got to know, like, okay, is this person, is this usual behavior for this person? And also not discrediting it too, if it is normal for that person, because if they are highly reactive, maybe they're very emotional, and so like one thing goes wrong and they're just very like strongly emotional. That can also be an indication that they'll do things that are more impulsive. And so we have to be aware of and careful, cautious of that kind of behavior too. But yeah, I mean, we basically, as a peer, as a friend, when you're supporting somebody, a peer looks like somebody who listens and empathizes. Maybe you're facing similar challenges and you guys are friends. You talk about different things with them. You connect on similar interests and you laugh. You have that social connection, maybe a friend group. You're around them more often and you're usually like there for each other. It's a reciprocal. But if it feels like the support that they need is beyond you and you're like, okay, I mean, I've done as much as I can as a friend, and you find yourself more falling into a role of therapist where it's like okay, they're just constantly in crisis. They're constantly coming to me for mental health support. If you're feeling that this is not something that you're trained in, supporting, that's a time to refer that person to a professional and say to your friend, look, I'm really worried about you. I love you. I care about you. And I can tell you're really struggling right now. And I feel like I've done as much as I can. I don't know how else to help you. And so I really think it would be best if we or if we connect you to the crisis line, or we talk to the school counselor, or a trusted adult that we know will take care of this issue and help you to maybe find a therapist. And then just helping to reduce any stigma that person may have against that. Some people nowadays, it's becoming more widely used and widely known about therapy. So I feel like there's a little bit of reduction in stigma, but it's still very prevalent, and especially in certain households where it's like there's a lot of shame about visiting a therapist, and it's like, oh, that's a sign of weakness, and that's something that like, oh, we just don't do that, kind of thing. And so breaking down any bias or stigma around that for your friend can be like, you're the gateway. Like, so if you can open that door, if you're not sure how to answer some of their questions and they're like, well, it's a sign of weakness. For that one, I usually say something along the lines of comparing it to visiting a doctor. So it's like, well, if you have a broken arm, I can't help you with that either. We got to go to the doctor. Like, this is basically the mental equivalent of that, where it's not that you're weak, it's just that you broke your arm mentally. Like, I don't know how to help that because that's beyond me. So we need to go and talk to a professional about that. So when we put it in terms, like, I always try to think in terms of that person. So like, if they're a mechanic, I may use some kind of mechanic analogy, or they're a soccer player. I'm like, well, even Messi has a coach, like you got to think about where that person's coming from, and get them connected to somebody that can help.
This is such helpful advice, and I really value when you say sometimes we don't have the capacity or knowledge to help someone, and so to refer someone to a professional is certainly something that I think we should all encourage. Kay, thank you so much for your time and for your insight on this really important topic.
Sure, thanks.
In our next episode, we'll talk to one man who's using comedy to break the stigma about mental health. As always, thank you for listening to the Avidum podcast. Special thanks to WellSpan for their support and to ND Sites for editing. You can follow Avidum on Instagram at Avidum. That's AEVIDUM. And you can learn more about what we do at avidum.org. I'm Stephen Juenmal, and I've got your back.